Okay, and we're going to go ahead and begin. As always, we will begin in prayer, um, and we'll go with St. Augustine's opening words. The confession essentially is a prayer. So in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Great are you, O Lord, and exceedingly worthy of praise. Your power is immense, and your wisdom beyond reckoning. And so we humans, who are a due part of your creation, long to praise you. We who carry our mortality about with us, carry the evidence of our sin, and with it the proof that you thwart the proud. Yet these humans, due part of your creation as they are, still do long to praise you. You stir us so that praising you may bring us joy, because you have made us and drawn us to yourself, and our heart is unquiet until it rests in you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. All right, so first of all, thank you very much for registering for this course. I am incredibly excited to be teaching this text, which has been important to me for the last 25 years. I'm humbled that there's as many people who want to take this class as there are. The registration numbers were at 230. So I'm hoping I can provide something that is up to your expectations. So as I said in an email that I sent out earlier, and last minute registrants didn't get this. I sent it out Wednesday last week. Each lecture is going to be structured in the following way. We're covering basically 2 books of the Confessions in each lecture. What I discovered through my own experience listening to talks, conferences, papers, etc., is that it doesn't really matter how interesting somebody is. 20 to 25 minutes is the tops that anybody's attention span has. So with that in mind, I'm going to lecture for 25 minutes. We'll take a 5-minute break for questions and also just a bit of a mental break. And then we'll come back. So practically speaking, it'll be 25 minutes of lecture, questions, 25 minutes, questions. So each lecture will be broke up into 4 parts, meaning basically in each lecture, we'll be covering each book of Augustine in sort of 2 sections. So Confessions book 1, Augustine, what we'll be talking about in this first half hour, his descriptions, fascinatingly enough, of his own infancy. And he writes about something that he acknowledges that he can't remember. And then his own reflections on learning to speak. And then after our first break, we'll go into his boyhood, descriptions of his schooling, the fact that he wasn't baptized, how much he hated studying Greek, and then his own reflections on boyhood sins. So we begin here with this fantastic prayer. And what is Confessions? It's sometimes described as the world's first autobiography, but it's not an autobiography in any sense that would sort of fit the genre today. The word that Augustine is using, confessions, in the Latin etymologically, confiteor means simply to speak with. Fateor is to speak and con is with. So a confession in its most literal sense. And if you want to just have something that you can take with you to the sacrament of reconciliation next time, the word confession itself does not literally originally mean to admit to sins. It means to speak with. All of this work is Augustine's conversation with God. And in his conversation with God, he's going to go back over how he came to find God, more appropriately, how God called Augustine back to himself. And rather than try to give a brief summary of Augustine's life, because even that in itself is impossible, I'll be including biographical, historical notes as they're necessary, but trying to keep the emphasis of this on the text itself. So on the one hand, Confessions is a conversation that Augustine's having with God of how he was brought back to God. But on the other hand, Augustine clearly intended this text to be read by other people. Probably the source that encouraged him to write this was a conversation between his friend Alypius, who ended up becoming a bishop in North Africa, just as Augustine did later in life, and Paulinus of Nola. The time period that we're looking at here is the late 4th century BC. So Christianity has been legalized by Constantine in AD 313. We're a couple of generations after that. Augustine's born in 354, so the events of his childhood, his boyhood, his high school years, basically, all occur before the year 383, which is the year in which the Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Before that, it was simply not persecuted anymore. There were many powerful people in the empire who were Christians, but it wasn't official. It's when Augustine is about 30 is when it goes from being a tolerated religion to being the official religion. And because of Augustine's conversion, there were people that wanted to know, isn't this kind of convenient that somebody who'd planned on a career in government just ends up having a miraculous conversion 3 years after Christianity becomes the official religion, and therefore being Christian could help out his career. So Augustine is a saint. That does not mean he was seen as a saint by everybody in his own day. And so part of this is, and we'll see this especially in Book 10, where Augustine is simply explaining to everybody that his conversion absolutely was sincere. It's not motivated by questions of moving up in the world, something that can help his career. And he'll do that by talking about how career motivated he was throughout the entire first half of this, but especially what we're going to look at today. So Paulinus of Nola was a Spaniard. He was an aristocrat. He was born into a wealthy family. He was a governor. He converted to Christianity. He and his wife had a child, and then they went through the heartbreak of losing that child on that child's 8th day. And after that experience, Paulinus of Nola turned himself completely to the church, became a priest, became a bishop after the death of his wife. And so Paulinus of Nola sort of had a similar background to Augustine, being part of this secular world, being well placed in the secular world, and having an experience that moved him into the church. So I don't think when he was writing to Alypius that he was suspecting Augustine of not being sincere. But I'll point out that Paulinus sort of had a similar track. And the other great church father that's going to figure in this story is St. Ambrose in Milan. And St. Ambrose didn't write an autobiography, so we don't know, he's not as commonly known as Augustine is. He did write beautiful, beautiful hymns, and we'll get to that when we talk about the situation in Milan in a couple of weeks. But Ambrose himself originally was part of the Roman political world. He was the prefect of Milan, which at that point in time was the imperial capital. And he was one of those who was sort of forced into the bishopric against his own will. The people of Milan demanded that he accept that position. And St. Ambrose sort of had the take at that moment of, apparently this is God's will, so I'm going to do my best. And St. Ambrose's best was very, very good. So what we have in the Confessions is this incredible moment in the history of the Roman Empire, where in a sense, you can see it's what had been the Roman Empire is going to no longer exist within Augustine's own life, but also within the history of Christianity as what had been 100 years earlier, a viciously persecuted sect. The worst of the persecutions are often assumed to have been those under Diocletian, around 303, 304. Augustine's born 50 years after that. Augustine goes into the world in which Christianity becomes the official religion. And there's so many of these brilliant minds that come together, and they have their different stories that bring them to God. And this is Augustine's story of that. So we already began with the opening paragraph, this fantastic prayer with this line that's the most famous line in all of Confessions. You stir us so that praising you may bring us joy, because you have made us and drawn us to yourself and our heart is unquiet until it rests in you. Some translations might have that as, our hearts are restless. One of the reasons that I picked this particular translation, Maria Bolding, who was a Benedictine nun, has a fantastic sense for the subtleties of Augustine's Latin. And that word that he uses, inquietum, is an unusual word, a little more unusual than just restless is in English. So that effect there. Our heart is unquiet till it rests in you. When we have a work like Confessions, it's very easy to make one of two mistakes. On the one hand, we can become sort of lovesick antiquarians. That is, we fall in love with the history behind this, we fall in love with the biography, but we sort of isolate Augustine and his story from the modern world. We look at it sort of academically, and we can find it for what we have to say about it. And then on the other hand, there's the mistake of identifying too closely with something, of seeing Augustine as just like us and not recognizing the incredible cultural differences between his world and ours. So sailing between the Scylla and Charybdis of two possible mistaken ways of interpreting him, what I'm going to try to do is respect the historicity of Augustine's life, that he has this cultural world that's not ours at all. However, the way that he responds to that is a way that is so profoundly human in its universal sense, universal human desires and failings, that it reaches out to us across this incredible cultural gap of 1600 years. And that sense that we have in this line, that God creates us, he stirs us so that praising him may bring us joy, because God has made us and drawn us to himself, and our hearts are unquiet until they rest in God. If you've signed up for this class, I'm assuming two things about you. On the one hand, that you've almost certainly had some experience in your life in which you know that the love of God is the most profound joy a human being can experience. But on the other hand, you also have the knowledge of personal experience that even though we know that, we quite often turn away from that fact and we try to find our happiness in other ways. So that unquiet heart that we have, the one that can never fully be satisfied by anything else that we do, if God is not our primary love. And if there's anything that we should have in our mind as we approach Augustine, it's this. For Augustine of the Confessions and Augustine the theologian, the key to interpreting everything is love. The key to the experience of God, to understanding God's creation, is an understanding that is based primarily upon love. Even the wicked deeds that we do are based in love, a twisted love, a love that is ultimately self-defeating, but it is love nonetheless. Okay, so about half the lecture time I've spent just going over the first paragraph, so we'll try to get moving a little faster now. What we have in this first chapter of book one is this extended prayer that turns into a meditation. Augustine then asks, grant me to know and understand, Lord, which comes first, to call upon you or to praise you, to know you or to call upon you. Must we know you before we can call upon you? And Augustine, Confessions are going to be filled with questions like these that can seem somewhat pedantic, but they're incredibly important. For Augustine, as we're going to see, his early life is based entirely on words and the use of words, the misuse of words. He's trained in rhetoric. And that's, if you want to make an advancement in the Roman Empire, that is the field that they care about the most. They considered philosophy, Romans in general considered philosophy something that was appropriate within bounds. People who wanted to devote their lives to it were somewhat effeminate Greeks, but that politics was the man's world. And you succeeded in politics by making arguments to convince people. And so rhetoric and oratory were the great arts. And that's what Augustine is trained in, is rhetoric. He goes through school, and we'll see that in a bit. He gets a job teaching rhetoric. He goes to the heights of what his field could be. He has a job in the imperial capital of Milan as a professor of rhetoric. And what we're also going to see are the two worlds that Augustine's in boyhood are divided between. Um, the rhetoric of the Roman world and the simple speaking about and to God. And they're worlds that cannot really be brought together. And that's going to be a lot of the stress that we find in Augustine. All of these questions that he has here, they're penetrating questions. And Augustine himself, as we go through this, he recognizes sort of what he's doing. See if I can find that particular line. He's talking about all of these questions that he has, and how even God himself might be laughing at him for asking these questions. I thought I had that marked. We'll come back to it though. I mean, Augustine does have a bit of a sense of humor, but particularly about himself. He's open. He asks all of these questions, and he acknowledges the potential absurdity of asking all of these questions. But they're questions that he has to ask on his particular way back to God. And as he's talking about God, how shall I call upon God? So chapter 2 here. How shall I call upon my God and my Lord, when by the very act of calling upon him, I would be calling him into myself? Is there any place within me into which my God might come? How should the God who made heaven and earth come into me? Is there any room in me for you, Lord, my God? Even heaven and earth, which you have made and in which you exist, can even they contain you? Since nothing that exists would exist without you, does it follow that whatever exists does in some way contain you? But if this is so, how can I, who am one of these existing things, ask you to come into me, when I would not exist at all unless you were already in me? Not yet am I in hell, after all, but even if I were, you would be there too. For if I descend into the underworld, you are there. No, my God, I would not exist. I would not be at all were you not in me. Or I should say rather, that I should not exist if I were not in you, from whom are all things, through whom are all things, in whom are all things. Yes, Lord, that is the truth. That is indeed the truth. And so Augustine has this way, when you read Confessions, you have to get used to the way that he presents it. It can be incredibly wordy at times. And it can seem like he's just running in rhetorical circles, which he's going to do because, that's his training. But he's always coming back to this question of the relationship between himself and God. And so the question of even calling God into him, he takes it, in a very literal sense. And he knows he's being overly literal here when he talks about God being contained within the universe that he created. But he comes back to this point that he himself, that is, Augustine should not exist if he were not in God. And the question here is the ultimate dependence of creature upon the creator. What is absolutely necessary for us to live a life that is coherent at all is to understand this relationship between ourselves and God, that we are not independent beings. We have free will, but to suggest that we can exist without God is a tremendous mistake. And that's going to be the cause of suffering. Suffering for others, suffering for Augustine is the confusion about this relationship. When we say that for Augustine, love is everything, love for Augustine is primarily understood as a relation. It's no accident that Augustine is the first of the church fathers to really expand this idea of the Trinity as one of relation. The Father loves the Son loves the Father, the Holy Spirit is the result of that love, that they exist in this relation of lover, beloved, and love. So the relation that Augustine has with God is what he's searching out throughout this entire work. And he's very clearly inviting us to ask these questions of ourselves and our own relation with God in this. And then after he's gone on, and we can see just the pages that he has here. But after saying all of this, and now we're in chapter 4 at the end. After saying all of this, what have we said, my God, my life, my holy sweetness? What does anyone who speaks of you really say? Yet woe betide those who fail to speak, while the chatterboxes go on saying nothing. And this other bit about Augustine that's fantastic is this seamless blending of idealism, these oratorical heights that he has, but then also the profound reality. What are we saying of God? The words that we have can't possibly come close to the reality of God, but we must speak. Especially as the chatterboxes go on with their many words, but their utter lack of substance. Chapter 6, paragraph 7, I sent out a note about the way that Confessions is ordered. We have the books, and what he calls a book is basically the length of what we would consider to be a long chapter. And then those are divided up, not by Augustine, but by editors probably in the 16th century, into chapters that are the small numbers here, and then into paragraph numbers, which are the large numbers, because we need to have multiple sets of arbitrary distinctions. The paragraphs don't reset with every chapter. So the paragraphs and chapters both start from number 1 in each book. So it's the 6th chapter here of Confessions, but the 7th paragraph of book 1 of Confessions. So he speaks of his infancy because he wants to speak of everything. Here we are. Yet allow me to speak, though I am but dust and ashes. Allow me to speak in your merciful presence. For it is to your mercy that I address myself, not to some man who would mock me. Perhaps you too are laughing at me, but still you will turn mercifully towards me. For what is it that I am trying to say, Lord, except that I do not know whence I came into this life that is but a dying, or rather this dying state that leads to life. I do not know where I came from. So for all of these words, and Augustine's speaking with God in his confession, but whereas he acknowledges other men might be laughing at all this, perhaps God is laughing at this as well. But even if God is laughing at us, he still turns towards us with mercy. And so he describes his infancy, not that he can remember any of it, of course. I know that I was welcomed by the tender care your mercy provided for me. For so I've been told by the parents who gave me life according to the flesh, those parents through whose begetting and bearing you formed me within time, although I do not remember it myself. The comforts of human milk were waiting for me, but my mother and my nurses did not fill their own breasts. Rather, you gave me an infant's nourishment through them in accordance with your plan, from the riches deeply hidden in creation. So this simple reflection on the fact that he can't remember his own infancy, but he knows what it must have been like. He has his parents who were there to remind him. But then we go beyond even what parents can remember, and we look at the simple act of nursing. It was certainly not that St. Monica decided to nurse that she was able to, but this natural state of mother, natural because God created it that way. That even the nourishment provided to him, not so much on his mother's will as through her, but by the will of God. All of this is in accordance with his plan, from the riches hidden deeply in creation. And then Augustine goes on and he reimagines what it must have been like when all he could do at first was cry out for milk. At that time, I knew only how to suck and be deliciously comforted, and how to cry when anything hurt me. After this, I began to smile, at first only in my sleep, then I was awake. So I have been told, and I believe it on the strength of what I see other babies do. Little by little, I began to notice where I was, and I would try to make my wishes known to those who might satisfy them. But I was frustrated in this because my desires were inside me while other people were outside and could by no effort of understanding enter my mind. And this simple reflection on the reality of infancy. And I have, 2 toddlers upstairs that, during the course of this class, you might get to hear them screaming from time to time when they don't get exactly what they want. But the experience of watching an infant and then a toddler as they slowly deal with not getting what they want whenever they want, become frustrated because they have desires that they cannot communicate. And that's what so much of Confessions ends up being, are these desires that Augustine has that he can't even communicate really to himself, that he struggles through these desires that are misdirected, and he's so lost in them that he loses the ability even to recognize just how lost he is. He knows only that he is. So I tossed about and screamed, sending signals meant to indicate what I wanted, those few signs that were the best I could manage, though they did not really express my desires. And again, a line written about an infant that describes a reality that goes far beyond infancy. The rest of this part, chapter 6, he continues going on with just what his infancy could have been, the question of memory, the reliability of his parents, recognizing what he must have been from the universal experience and the universal experience that he sees in infants. He applies the universal experience of the failures that he sees in adults to understand himself as well. And then once again, are you laughing at me for asking you these questions? Are you perhaps commanding me to praise you and confess to you simply about what I do know? And I think that's a good point to stop just for this first little introduction to the first half of book 1. The questions that we see that Augustine brings up again and again: language, the use of words, relationships, and desire. Those end up being the most important themes that we're going to come across throughout this entire work. So we'll take a 5-minute break. If you need to go get anything, do that now. If you have any questions, let's start with just typing questions in chat. Okay, so just a practical question about the recordings. The recordings are limited to this group only. You've all paid for this, so I'm going to respect the fact that, you've paid for this. They're not going to be freely available. I will be uploading this after we're done with the lesson tonight. It usually takes YouTube about an hour or so to process a file of this size, and then I will be emailing you a link. Now, anybody who has that link will be able to use it. So I would ask you, please do not share that link with anybody beyond this class. The line numbers that you have are, yeah, so there's 2 different sets of numbers that we have here. Some other editors have also added their own set of numbers in on top of this. Almost all of them will have sort of like in parentheses one set of numbers that should match up with this. Okay, request volume on the mic. I will try to get that turned up here. Okay, is that better, the volume adjustment there? Okay. So the original text is written in Latin. And it's Augustine's Latin is just absolutely beautiful. He probably, all of his writings are in Latin, and it's this very classical Latin that you would expect from somebody who's just so steeped in the Latin classics as Augustine is. It's very possible that in North Africa he would have spoken also a Phoenician dialect, which was common among some of the laboring classes. And by then he would have spoken a version of Latin that was branching off and heading towards a vernacular language. But what he writes is all of this beautiful classical Latin. Written communication between Augustine and Ambrose, there's there are letters. I'll do what I can to see if I can find the particular letters to Ambrose. Augustine's writings, most of them are available in like 18th century translations. Augustine wrote a ton. There's a line in the Middle Ages they describe arrogant intellectuals as someone who's read all of Augustine, not meaning that that person had spent so much time reading, but meaning that that person was lying about what they knew, because it was just understood that Augustine had written so much that nobody could have read all of it. The original manuscripts, so the original manuscript no longer exists. The oldest manuscript of this, I can go into the manuscript history. I think the oldest manuscript we have of Confessions is the 6th century, so about 200 years after he would have written this. But off the top of my head, I'm not positive about the original manuscripts. But no, the original definitely does not exist. I think the oldest is 6th century, but I'm not positive on that. And the question of his childhood issues, yeah, so I mean, some of this is coming from what Saint Monica told him, and he mentions that in parts that we skipped over a bit. But part of this is also him just assuming what his childhood must have been like based on what he's seen everywhere else. So yeah, okay, so when are the Confessions written is a good question. All of this detail that we'll throw in as necessary, trying not to overwhelm you with all of the history. So Augustine goes to Milan in 385, 386. He is introduced to Christianity in the adult sense through the lectures of Saint Ambrose. He originally went to watch Ambrose speak because he heard Ambrose was a fantastic speaker. And then just one of the most beautiful God working in his ways moments ever. Augustine, who is trained in rhetoric and is just trying to learn rhetorical devices from St. Ambrose, is won over by the content of Ambrose's sermons. And then he ends up being baptized in the spring of 387. After he's baptized, the plan is to go back to North Africa. St. Monica dies before they reach Africa. She dies as they're in Rome. And then he spends about 4 years in a community, not quite a monastic community, but an ascetic community. And then he becomes a priest, and then against his will, he's recruited into being a bishop, because if you have somebody of his intelligence and his training, you put them to the best use that you can for the church. And it's generally assumed that 396, 397 is the period in which he writes the Confessions. That's the general timeline. So he's writing this about 10 years after having converted. He's been a priest for about 6 years and a bishop only very recently. And so he would have been about 40. Oh, wow. So he's my age as he's writing this. Wow, that's depressing for what we've accomplished, relatively speaking. So about 397, he's just entering the phase where he's going to be producing all of these writings, basically for the rest of his life. And again, he writes a ton. The most well-known works that he has are the Confessions, the City of God, which is just an enormous work, and on the Trinity. Those would be his 3 most important works, but he writes all kinds of homilies. So many of his sermons are recorded, letters back and forth. His letters with Saint Jerome are fantastic because they're such different personalities. And there was a question that somebody had about the way that he's writing, and it sounds like the Psalms. So Augustine had been just completely immersing himself within the scriptures for the 10 years before writing Confessions. As soon as he becomes as soon as he's baptized, he immerses himself fully into the faith, but with that same set of study skills that he had picked up as a fantastic student. So he'd been reading the Bible nonstop for 10 years, basically. And the effect of that, of course, is that it influences even the way that you write. So you'll see all of these numbers in footnotes where they're talking about it. Augustine is taking this from the Psalms or this from wisdom or from the prophets. Sometimes he's intentionally citing a text that way. Sometimes the words of the Psalms, which, you know, as part of just the divine office, he's saying those every day. Sometimes those are, he just naturally expresses himself in those words. Okay, and with that, we're going to move on to our second part. Augustine goes to school. And so if there's any takeaway from this that might make the most sense for everybody, when people talk about classical education, especially if they want us to talk about classical education today, they might want to say classically inspired education. Classical education itself had corporal punishment pretty much as its foundation. And Augustine is very bitter about that. I mean, he's writing as a 42-year-old, speaking about just the absolute terrors of school. There's a passage in the City of God that's just so moving, where he says to the effect of, if somebody had the option of either spending eternity in hell or being reborn as a child, who on earth would choose to go through the torments of childhood again? The major thing that we look at when we read this section is the role of schooling in the plans that his parents have for him and his own confusion of that. Saint Monica is a saint. That does not mean that she's perfect. And Augustine's family, his father Patricius is a pagan, his mother Monica is a Christian. Which is fairly common. It's extremely common in early Roman history. If you've ever read the stories of the saints and you're wondering why there are so many virgin martyrs, young Christian women who were betrothed to pagan men, and then ended up dying because they didn't want to marry them. There is actually a very simple and horrible explanation for why you have so many Christian wives and mothers and relatively fewer Christian fathers. And this gets to the heart of what it was that Christianity rejected about Roman culture, is that it's solely due to Christianity that Western culture stopped practicing infanticide against women. In the Greco-Roman world, women were not as valuable as men. They could not do the same amount of labor for poor families. And for richer families, marrying them off sometimes involved a dowry that could be incredibly expensive. And so quite often when a child was born and it was female, it would simply be left to die. Modern population demographers have looked at the ancient world and figured out that pagan society was about 58% male. And it was 58% male because women were not allowed to live to the same extent that men were. So for this reason, if you were a pagan male, it was hard to find brides because in this society, there were basically, 3 guys for every 2 girls. Since in Christianity, abortion was also widely practiced and the church ended that as a practice. Because in Christianity, abortion was forbidden and infanticide was forbidden. Within Christian society, that was the only part of society where there were equal number of boys and girls. And so for pagan Roman society, quite often it was easier to marry a Christian girl simply because there were more of them. That's the situation with Augustine's family. Is the father is pagan, Monica is Christian. Monica wants Augustine to become Christian as well, but as we're going to find out here, she also wanted him to be successful in the world. And that creates incredible tensions for Augustine as he's looking back on this. And he loved his mother dearly. Augustine is not the modern, I want to be resentful towards my parents because that's what everybody does. Augustine loves his mother dearly. That comes out so clearly in Confessions. But he's still 35 years after the fact very hurt and confused about what happened in his upbringing. Um, so chapter 9, paragraph 14, ah, God, my God, what wretchedness I suffered in that world, and how I was trifled with. The program for right living presented to me as a boy was that I must obey my mentors so that I might get on in this world and excel in the skills of the tongue, skills which led to high repute and deceitful riches. To this end, I was sent to school to learn my letters. So what I talked about before with rhetoric, that was the Roman art. And this is why Augustine is sent to school, so that he can learn to speak well, so that he can advance in Roman society. Patricius and Monica had, they came from some background. They have enough money to send him to school, which was not cheap. They're clearly not extremely wealthy, but they had enough to hold on. And with that idea, that perennial idea of education can result in our child having a better life than we have. What this means to Augustine is that he's handed over as a child to learn grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and he's handed over to a schoolmaster that beats them when they don't remember things. And what Augustine sees in this is beyond the corporal punishment, there's also the goals of that world, skills which led to high repute and deceitful riches. I might get on in this world and excel. The drive to excel is all that these schools are about. On the one hand, he grows up with Monica telling him about God and telling him about the worldview of Christianity. And that worldview is just not compatible with the pagan Roman worldview of life is competition. And all of this, you have to strive for excellence in everything so that you can be the best in this school, so that you can go to the best. So you have to be the best in the grammar school, you win awards in the grammar school so that you can go to the best school of rhetoric. You do the best in the school of rhetoric so that you can get a job teaching. You do the best teaching that you can so that you can go on to the better school. The exact same path of advancement that we have in our world today is what Augustine is dealing with. And of those moments where what Augustine's saying is just so heartbreakingly modern. During the day, I teach high school at Holy Family High School in Broomfield. And just the insane pressure that high school students are under today to be perfect in everything, to not have any flaws so that they can have the perfect resume to present for college applications, with the idea that without having, the perfect resume, they can't get into these good schools. Without these good schools, they'll be shut out through life. The effect that this has is horrible. There's no simple answer to this, of course. I'm not going to encourage my students not to excel. I'm not going to encourage my students not to do their absolute best. But at a point in time, at what point does pushing a student to excel turn into what we're going to see happen to Augustine here, what I see happen to so many students, where this desire, this competitive spirit becomes all-consuming. And so Augustine tells us in this chapter as well, we have just the first bit about the beating that occurs in the learning. All the same, I would be beaten whenever I was lazy about learning. This punishment was taken for granted by grown-up people, and many a pupil had undergone it before we did, laying down those rough roadways along which we were now being driven, as we bore our part in the heavy labor and pain allotted to the sons of Adam. The corporal punishment in these schools was no joke. Augustine is not overly sensitive or anything here. He's remembering something that any student who went through the system would have remembered. And the way that he connects this here, that he sees education as part of, the labor and pain allotted to the sons of Adam. He goes back to the fall in the garden, and what God says to Adam is his lot because he chose to do what he did. The discussions that he has about school here, and I wish I had time to go over all of this. We just don't. We'll notice I will read this line. You did not hear my prayer, paragraph 14, chapter 9, lest by hearing it, you might have consigned me to a fool's fate. Augustine praying to be spared school. So my stripes were laughed at by my elders and even my parents, who would not have wished anything bad to happen to me, but bad it was and very dreadful to me. Imagining a world, and this is where we're completely different, where a child comes home from school, and we're talking an elementary school child here. A child comes home from school bearing bruises and scars from the lesson. And rather than being horrified, the parents laugh about it. And as we see very clearly, it's their laughter that Augustine's really remembering later on. They wouldn't have wished anything bad to happen to him anywhere else. He was their pride and joy. He was what they sunk everything into. And they wouldn't have wished anything bad for him to happen anywhere. But where they put him, bad it was and very dreadful for me. And then Augustine, as he's so often able to do, recognizing that his individual torment here is not unique to himself. They're beaten for playing too much rather than doing their work. It was simply that we loved to play and that we were punished by adults who nonetheless did the same themselves. But whereas the frivolous pursuit of grown-up people are called business, children are punished for behaving in the same fashion, and no one is sorry for either the children or the adults. And we look at life and what life turns into, the idea that everybody has going through school, that once I get through this, things are going to be better and they'll be different. Once I get through elementary school, once I get through middle school, high school will be different, then college will be different. And then once we get a job and into the real world, it'll be different. But it never is. The frivolous pursuits, they take a new name of business, but the core experience is the same. And then he looks at the master himself, the schoolmaster here, the one who is administering the beatings. Moreover, was the master who flogged me any better himself? And Augustine's referring to this playtime that he had as a boy, and how as a boy he wanted to win, and would even be willing to cheat or abuse others so that he could win just in games. If the master had been worsted by a fellow scholar in some pedantic dispute, would he not have been racked by even more bitter jealousy than I was when my opponent in a game of ball got the better of me? And that's absolutely still true today. The smartest people at the best universities in the world are just some of the most petty people on earth. That line about academia that it's so vicious because the stakes are so small. That attitude that we had about pouting on the schoolyard because we didn't get our way. You can grow up all you want. Some fellow scholar is bested in a pedantic dispute by some other scholar, and he pouts the exact same way as that child. And Augustine recognizes, that he wasn't the best student. His disruption from playtime is sinful. But he's looking at his motivation in this, and the motivation that's also encouraged in the school and by his parents. I hankered to win for myself glory in our contests, and to have my ears tickled by tall stories which only made them itch more hotly. And all the while, that same curiosity more and more inflamed my eyes with lust for the public shows, which are the games of grown-ups. So public theater, public entertainment. The people who provide these entertainments enjoy such celebrity and public esteem that nearly all of them hope their children will follow their example. And yet they are quite prepared to see those children beaten for watching similar shows to the detriment of their study which, as their parents hope, will bring them to a position in which they in turn will provide the shows. Look with mercy on these follies, Lord, and set us free, all who call upon you. Set free those also who do not yet call upon you, so that they may invoke you and you may give them freedom. All of this world of competition, wanting to be the best, that we never end up leaving that playground. the celebrity that's enjoyed by society, the celebrity that they hope to pass on to their own children. But the way that they prepare these children of Augustine's parents, but all of the parents in this world, um, you have to stay with your study no matter what, hoping that it brings them in a position that their children will be in the position then when they're providing the shows. So the background in the Roman world behind that, providing the shows, providing the entertainment. Having the goodwill of the public was incredibly important for any Roman politician, even in the empire. And it's very telling that when Rome got rid of the Republic and they had emperors instead, one of the first things that they did is that private individuals were no longer allowed to sponsor gladiatorial games, which is what had happened in the Republic. Because the emperors were afraid that any individual that put on a gladiatorial game would become so popular with the crowd that they would then become a threat to the empire itself. So what Augustine's talking about there, in which they in turn will provide the shows, the people that pay for these spectacles for the public, those are the rich and powerful, and they use the forms of entertainment to keep the people on their side. And we have a break in all of this story about his terrible experience growing, his terrible experience being schooled, the beating that's involved in that, the non-stop sense of competition that is completely at odds with everything that he's heard about Christianity. We have this story of his own baptism. St. Monica did not have Augustine baptized as an infant. And he'll get into the story about why. Infant baptism was not universally practiced when Augustine was a child. It's actually because of Augustine's influence that infant baptism becomes the norm rather than the exception. While I was still a boy, chapter 11, I had heard about the eternal life promised to us through the humility of our Lord and God, who stooped even to our pride. And I was regularly signed with the cross and given his salt, even from the womb of my mother, who firmly trusted in you. You saw, Lord, how one day in my boyhood, I was suddenly seized by stomach pains, and as my fever mounted, came near to death. You saw, my God, because even then you were guarding me. With what distress and what faith I earnestly begged to be baptized into your Christ, who is my God and my Lord. You saw how I pleaded with my loving, kindly mother, and with the mother of all of us, your church. She who had given me life according to the flesh was very anxious, because in her pure heart, through her faith in you, and with a love still more tender, she was bringing my eternal salvation to birth. She would have hastened to ensure that I was initiated into the saving sacraments and washed clean by confessing you, Lord Jesus, for the forgiveness of sins, had I not rapidly recovered. So Augustine, St. Monica is only willing to have him baptized if it looks like he's on his deathbed. But he recovers, and so he's not baptized. My cleansing, therefore, was deferred on the pretext that if I lived, I would inevitably soil myself again. For it was held that the guilt of sinful defilement incurred after the laver of baptism was graver and more perilous. So in the days of the early church, confession as we know it wasn't formalized quite yet. There was confession, there was reconciliation, there was the ability to be forgiven of sins. What was understood is that baptism wiped away all of the sins. Public and confession then was public. If you sinned after baptism, it was a major issue. Quite often, you would be held away from the sacraments for an extended period of time. You would have to do public penance. It was a little rougher than it is today. And so a lot of people looked at this and they thought what would be best is to hold off baptism until the very end of life. Since baptism washed away everything, we'll hold off on that till the end of life, and then you can die knowing that you are clean. This is what the Emperor Constantine did. Constantine legalized Christianity in 313, but he wasn't baptized himself until he was on his deathbed in 336. So St. Monica is holding back on the baptism because she doesn't want Augustine to incur more guilt after his baptism, because it was held that sins committed afterwards were much worse. And so then we have here in 18, Augustine speaking directly with God, and obviously this experience is still haunting him years later. My God, I beg you to tell me, for which I would very much like to know, if it is your will, to what purpose my baptism was postponed, whether it was for some good that the restraints against sinning were in some degree slackened for me. It is true, is it not, that they were slackened? Why? And this is the effect of, and this is one of the reasons later on why Augustine is such a proponent of infant baptism, is number one, I mean, it's sort of a loophole. We know that we'll have people claiming to live as Christians, but holding off on this till the very last bit, because they can die knowing that they're clean. But the reality of what happens to somebody, how they're treated when they haven't been baptized yet. Why is it that we still hear, and Augustine's talking about this is in the 390s, people saying on all sides of another person, let him be, let him do as he likes. He is not baptized yet. Where bodily health is at stake, we do not say, let him be. Let him go on injuring himself. He is not cured yet. How much better would it have been if I had been healed at once, and if everything had been done by my own efforts and those of my family to ensure that the good health of my soul had received should be kept safe in the care of you who had given it. So what ends up happening in this world where baptism is deferred is, if somebody had been baptized, you're holding them to this higher standard to live as a Christian. However, since if they haven't been baptized yet, that extreme standard isn't held up against them. So the effect of not having Augustine baptized in this moment is to tacitly approve of continued sin, as long as they're just kind of minor sins. And that's exactly what ends up happening to him. So for Augustine, we talk about how he's torn in these different directions, that St. Monica wants him to be Christian, wants him to accept Christ, wants him to accept the love of God. On the other hand, she also wants him to succeed in secular Roman society. She's also fearing for his soul, knowing that when he goes into secular society, it's very likely that he's going to sin. So she withholds baptism with the idea that he can be baptized later and have all of these youthful sins washed away as well. But Augustine himself is looking at this, and how can this be interpreted in any other way other than, how are you viewing me if you're not giving me everything for the benefit of my soul, my complete self? This is what Augustine sees in these actions. And as he's in his 40s here, and his mother's been dead for 10 years, this is still troubling him. I assume we would all be troubled. And looking at the time, this was the major part that I wanted to talk about, was the role of education and that baptism, and why that baptism was withheld, and what that, and the effect that that ended up having on him, basically, tacitly approving him to commit more sins. He talks quite a time here about how much he hated learning Greek, which I think anybody who's attempted to learn Greek can definitely commiserate with. But then he also talks about the usefulness of grammar as opposed to literature, and how learning to read and write was so much more important than the literature that he learned. And the last part that we'll notice here is he's talking about the characters from the Aeneid, the great Roman epic. Far more useful were those studies than others, in which I was forced to memorize the wanderings of some fellow called Aeneas, while forgetting my own waywardness, and to weep over Dido, who killed herself for love, when all the while, in my intense misery, I put up with myself with never a tear, as I died away from you, O God, who are my life. What indeed is more pitiful than a piteous person who has no pity for himself? I could weep over the death Dido brought on herself out of love for Aeneas, yet I shed no tears over the death I brought upon myself by not loving you. And we have that fantastic sense of what education is. What good is it for Augustine to read the Aeneid, to know about Aeneas and Dido, to be drawn in by Virgil's incredible poetry, and to be fascinated by Aeneid, to suffer for Dido. What good is it to have this academic experience when his own ability to feel that for himself has been cut off? Okay, with that, we'll take our next question break here, and we'll go with questions over chat again. So had they determined which girls were allowed to live? Wealth of the family would have had something to do with it. And it wasn't in every case that all girls were, and the term that they use for this here is exposure. Rather than killing the infant, they would simply abandon it so that it could be torn apart by wild beasts, because they knew what they were doing was wrong and couldn't be confronted with killing it themselves, killing the child. The way that they determined it, it's not clear. But, again, this wasn't done with all girls. The ratio ended up being about 3 boys for every 2 girls. So it was done with quite a few. The wealth of the family would have had something to do with it. The job of the family. It's one of those things that we don't, or at least I'm not aware of, how clear our understanding of this is. It was a widespread phenomenon, and what even secular sociologists agree on is that Christianity is what put a stop to it. Okay. Chapter 12, paragraph 19. No one is doing right who acts unwillingly, even if what he does is good in itself. How he views all actions in moral theology. I'm not sure if that's a viewpoint that is consistent throughout all of his theology. So keep in mind that Augustine goes on, he lives until AD 430, and he writes that entire time. So there are, 33 years of mature development of thought after this. And I will upfront, this will be my disclaimer for everybody. By my training, my PhD is in comparative literature. So I'm a literary scholar. I am not a theologian. So number one, if I say anything that theologically might sound suspect or is at odds with what proper authorities have said, I'm a literary scholar, not a theologian. Anything that I might, number one, I might misstate something. Number two, as not a theologian, I might not understand something. But in terms of Augustine's moral theology, no one is doing right who acts unwillingly, even if what he does is good in itself. That statement there, even Augustine would almost certainly make a lot of qualifications about. As far as the overall consensus of the church, I'm definitely going to defer that to an actual theologian before I trot into something that's clearly not my field. I will come up with an answer for that, though. As an educator and a father, Augustine's reflections on it. Oh yeah. So what Augustine's saying here, this is, as an educator, I'm deeply influenced by this. The pressures that we put on students to achieve, to be best, to win awards, as Augustine talks in a section that we skipped over about winning an award and everybody being, so proud of him for that, everybody being happy. But the award in itself not being particularly significant. And next week, when we get to book 3, we'll notice when Augustine finally discovers something in his education that is significant, that has real substance to it. So making sure that as an educator, I'm doing everything I can to help bring out, it's a trite line, but it's a good one, the best version of themselves that students can be. and making sure that that does not cross the line into putting unhealthy pressures upon them. And it's a very hard line to know exactly where that is. The students, I mean, I can say without a doubt that the students of today have pressures that my generation absolutely did not. I mean, just today there was a story of basically a tuition and financial aid fixing scandal that involved all kinds of elite universities. Both my alma maters, Notre Dame and Columbia, were involved in this. This world that we have of higher education, where how much actual education is going on in this, and how much of this is just credentialism. How much of this is, I'm not interested, like, we're not valuing the actual learning that occurs at an Ivy League university. We just want to have that Ivy League diploma because we know that people will bow down before that. I mean, it's something that Augustine would have immediately recognized. So yeah, this Augustine is something that I come back to this constantly, both in the sense of making sure that I'm not making things worse on my students, but in the sense of when I'm teaching, what are my students experiencing that I don't know about? And this is something that's really come out in the last 3 years now that we've been dealing with this pandemic. It was always there before, but the pandemic helped us as educators to really keep this always present. Is just because a student presents a certain way in class, you have no idea what's going on in their home life. You have no idea the pressures that they're dealing with. You have no idea everything that they're facing as they're trying to deal with all of the pressure of education on top of that. And I think a bit of compassion is definitely something that, more compassion is something that's become part of, my trade over the last few years. And that's something that Augustine absolutely brings out, particularly when we look at what he has to say, in book 2. Book 2 of Confessions is basically his high school years. And I don't think what he describes has really changed much. All right, with that, we will then go on. I should have ended that bit with the final prayer. So we'll do that right now. The closing, the thanksgiving that he has at the end of book 1. In a living creature such as this, everything is wonderful and worthy of praise. But all these things are gifts from my God. I did not endow myself with them, but they are good, and together they make me what I am. He who made me is good, and he is my good too. Rejoicing, I thank him for all those good gifts which made me what I was, even as a boy. In this lay my sin, that not in him was I seeking pleasures, distinctions, and truth, but in myself and the rest of his creatures. And so I fell headlong into pains, confusions, and errors. But I give thanks to you, my sweetness, my honor, my confidence. To you, my God, I give thanks for your gifts. Do you preserve them for me? So will you preserve me too. And what you have given me will grow and reach perfection. And I will be with you, because this too is your gift to me, that I exist. So book 2, we move into Augustine's adolescence, sexual awakening. He comes home from his studies for a year as an adolescent with nothing to do, never a good combination. And then his reflections on marriage. Something else, a question that he still has. Why did his mother act in a certain way that in his 40s he still can't understand? And then after we have our next break, we'll come back to the episode of the pear tree, which I'll just let that speak for itself. And so now we'll get into Augustine's incredible, brutal honesty about himself. Um, so, first chapter here. There was a time in adolescence when I was afire to take my fill of hell. I boldly thrust out rank, luxurious growth in various furtive love affairs. My beauty wasted away, and I rotted in your sight, intent on pleasing myself and winning favor in the eyes of men. And that fantastic honesty that he has about his sexual exploits as a teenager, that it's part of it is the pleasing himself, but also in that is winning favor in the eyes of men. He'll come to a point later on where he talks about hanging out with the guys where if as they're talking about what they're doing, he'll make up these stories about his sexual life so that he can look as though he's on the same level as they are. What was it that delighted me? Only loving and being loved, but there was no proper restraint, as in the union of mind with mind, where a bright boundary regulates friendship. From the mud of my fleshy desires and my erupting puberty belched out murky clouds that obscured and darkened my heart until I could not distinguish the calm light of love from the fog of lust. The two swirled about together and dragged me, young and weak as I was, over the cliffs of my desires and engulfed me in a whirlpool of sins. Your anger had grown hot at my doings, yet I did not know. I was deafened by that clanking chain of my mortal state, which was the punishment for my soul's pride, and I was wandering away from you, yet you let me go my way. And as always, the way that he's able to describe with just such brutal honesty his own state. You know, what was it that delighted him? Loving and being loved, but without restraint, as in the union of mind with mind, where a bright boundary regulates friendship. And friendship is something that the ancient world, the Roman world understood friendship very well. The friend being another that you love as yourself. Love that you have for friends being willing their good. And in the ancient world, friendship has its best definition as the love of virtue in another. The Roman world didn't have much positive when it comes to romantic relationships. A man and woman in love, there's nobody in the Roman world speaks about that. What Augustine would have been reading. It's a completely homosocial world. It's all men. Friendship is something that exists between men of status, men of virtue, and they love the virtue in another. And that's the bright boundary regulates friendship, the union of mind with mind. So it's something where it's not just that you have people to hang out with, it's that you admire somebody's behavior and their behavior spurs you to act the best. That's the classical world of friendship. There's nothing similar when it comes to relations between man and a woman. In the Roman world, marriage is something that is useful. The state saw it as useful as a way of making more Romans. But as we talked about, that was always difficult because rampant use of birth control, abortion, infanticide. Roman families did not particularly want children. When Octavian becomes Augustus and the first emperor, one of the very first rules that he passes or the first laws that he passed, is he's trying to do everything he can to get the Roman aristocrats to have more children so that the Roman aristocracy can repopulate itself. And all of those attempts failed. The idea that there could be love in marriage is not a very common one at all. The idea that we have today that love is fundamental to marriage is, historically speaking, a very new one. The Christian world at Augustine's time is bringing that about, but it's something that Augustine at this time simply cannot understand. And we'll see his confusion at what Christian marriage is because it's so different from a Roman sort of political arrangement. The Romans also, however, when it came to sexual affairs, they had no problem with that whatsoever. the idea that a male student should have a concubine, a woman that he has lived with him, that he could be faithful to or not, it didn't really matter. But that a young man of means would have somebody that was not an equal, that there was no prospect of marriage, that actually social status would forbid him from marrying, that he took around sort of as a pleasure object. The Roman world had no problem with that whatsoever. And so Augustine is trying to understand his sexuality in a Christian world that he's not given access to, and we'll see that in just a second, but in a Roman world that cannot distinguish between libido on the one hand, which is fine for concubines, and then just political arrangements, business marriages, on the other hand, where the question of love doesn't even come up. In the Roman world, girls were usually married by the age of 13. On occasion, sometimes as young as 11. And as we get into those habits of the Roman world that make us understand why the Christian community just rejected them entirely. There was nothing objectionable in the Roman world to a grown man marrying a prepubescent 11-year-old and consummating that marriage. That was extremely common. So that's what Augustine has on the one hand, and then on the other hand, he has this Christian world, this Christian concept of marriage that he does not have access to. So Augustine is, your typical teenager dealing with emotions and drives that he's utterly unable to control. And he's noticing that God let him go his own way, that God allowed him the use of his free will. At that time, you kept silence as I continued to wander from you and sowed more and more sterile seeds to my own grief, abased by my pride and wearied by my restlessness. Who was there to alleviate my distress? No one took thought to arrange a marriage for me, so that my pursuit of fleeting beauties through most ignoble experiences might be diverted into useful channels. And so Augustine's looking at this, and he's thinking, at the age of 40, he's looking back and he's thinking about St. Paul's lines, where Paul is talking about, if you can't control yourself, it's best to be married. It's better to be married than to burn in desire you can't control. And Augustine wants to know, why is it that nobody even thought about arranging a marriage for him so that at least his desires could be channeled in a proper direction? Some bounds might have been set to my pleasure if only the stormy surge of my adolescence had flung me up onto the shore of matrimony. Or again, if I had been unable to find tranquility in that way, content to use my sexuality to procreate children as your law enjoins, O Lord, since you propagate the stock of our mortal race by this means, powerfully using your gentle hand to control the thorns which have no place in your paradise. For your almighty power is never far from us, even when we are far from you. If, as I say, I could not have found peace in marriage, this at all events is certain, that I ought to have listened more attentively to the voice from your clouds, which proclaimed, those who marry will have trials in their married life, and I would wish to spare you. And again, it is a good thing for a man not to touch a woman, and an unmarried man is preoccupied with the affairs of God and with pleasing God, but a married man is preoccupied with the affairs of the world and with pleasing his wife. Yes, I could have listened more attentively to those words and made myself a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven. In that way, I might have waited more contentedly for your embrace. But I was far too impetuous, poor wretch. So I went with the flood tide of my nature and abandoned you. You were ever present to me, mercifully angry, sprinkling very bitter disappointment over all my unlawful pleasures, so that I might seek a pleasure free from all disappointment. And here Augustine gets to the crux of the issue, is that he does not enjoy what he's doing. What he is doing cannot give him the satisfaction that he's looking for. He's looking for fulfillment. He's looking for a kind of happiness that these actions cannot give him, but he doesn't stop these actions. And what Augustine understands so well is the motivations that we have behind whatever it is. And I'm going to assume everybody in this audience has had this experience of that vice, that habit of sin, where you know what you're doing is wrong. You know, not just that what you're doing is wrong, but you know that what you're doing is impotent to deliver the happiness you're seeking from it. You know that gorging yourself at food is not going to help solve whatever problem it is that you're finding solace in food from. You know that sexual gratification in certain ways is not going to please you. It's not going to solve the problems that are pushing you in that direction, but you engage in it anyway. This compulsive behavior that we have with things that cannot make us happy and that we know cannot make us happy. This is what Augustine is going to be looking at in the rest of this book. And so in that same year, my 16th, my studies were interrupted and I was brought back from Madura, a nearby city where I had been lodging for instruction in literature and rhetoric. So Augustine had been sent from his hometown in Sagast. Since, he excelled in his grammar school there, which allowed him to be accepted to the rhetoric and literature school, which is in Madura. So, he's gone a step up. The plans that his parents have for him, they're succeeding. But his father runs out of money because his father recognizes that Augustine is so good that he can be sent to Carthage. And Carthage, so if I hadn't explained, Augustine grows up in sort of what's now Tunisia, very far eastern Algeria. And Carthage is the major city. It's the second major city in the Western Roman Empire at this point. Sagast it's a backwaters. Madura is one step up from that. And his father's constantly looking for the next step up, the next step up. And he does so well at Madura that Carthage is the next place to go. Though it was his shameless ambition that suggested the plan, not his wealth. For he was no more than a fairly obscure town councillor at Sagast. So as Augustine is dealing with these hormonal urges that he just cannot control, his father brings him home from school and he's sitting at home with basically nothing to do for this year as his father's saving up money to then send him to Carthage where the better school is. And then he reflects on this plan. At the time I speak of, anyone would have heaped praise upon my father, a man prepared to go beyond his means in spending as much money as was needed to send his son away to study, even in a distant city. No such efforts were made on behalf of the children of many other citizens who were far richer. So not only is Patricius here looking for Augustine's future with the hope of he's going to have that famous son, but he's also, even by bringing Augustine home and saving up all of this money, he's being rewarded socially. You can just imagine him, if social media had been around, putting up all of those posts about everything that he's doing for his son's education. Because the equivalent of that is what's happening here in the 4th century. Yet all that while, the same father of mine was unconcerned about how I would grow up for you, and cared little that I should be chaste, provided that I was intellectually cultivated. It would be truer to say that I was left fallow. And there's a word play here that we can't translate into English. To cultivate, we have the sense of someone who's cultured and well-read, but literally to cultivate is a field. It's the act of plowing and reaping. So it would be truer to say, rather than being cultivated, that he was a field that was left fallow of your cultivation, God, who are the only true and good owner of your field. And then one day his father's with him in the baths, and his father sees that Augustine's going through puberty, and then his father is just absolutely thrilled with this because now he's thinking, that he's going to have grandchildren. And he gleefully announced his discovery to my mother. His glee sprang from that intoxication which has blotted you, our creator, out of this world's memory and led it to love the creature instead. And this is behind so much of sin, so much of our twisted loves, that we love good things, but we love them in the wrong way. We love the creature instead of the creator. This isn't to say that that creatures, that God's creation shouldn't be loved, but they should never be loved as God, as the creator. And then he turns to Monica. In my mother's soul, however, you had already begun to build your temple and prepare for your holy indwelling, whereas my father was still a catechumen, and a recent one at that. So it so often happens in these marriages between Christian women and pagan men. The wife is eventually able to win over the husband, and he converts. We're not sure how serious Patricius was at his conversion. But Augustine lets us know at this point he was a catechumen. She therefore started up in devout fear and trembling, for she was afraid for me, even though I was not yet a Christian. She saw the twisted paths I followed, those paths trodden by people who turn their backs to you, not their faces. But what does she have for Augustine? She urged me to keep clear of fornication, and especially not to commit adultery with any man's wife. I remember in my inmost heart the intense earnestness with which she cautioned me against this. But these warnings seemed to me mere woman's talk. Which I would have blushed to heed. In truth, they came from you, but I failed to realize that and assumed you were silent and she was alone. By using her, you were not silent to me at all. And when I scorned her, I was scorning you. I, her son, the son of your handmaid, I, your servant. But I was quite reckless. I rushed on headlong in such blindness that when I heard other youths of my own age bragging about their immoralities, I was ashamed to be less depraved than they. I pretended to obscenities I had not committed, lest I might be thought less courageous for being more innocent and be accounted cheaper for being more chaste. And so we run into just the absolute absurdity of adolescent lust, where Augustine knows what he's doing is wrong. He has his mother telling him this is wrong, but it's embarrassing then to be listening to a woman about such things. And even his own actions that he's branching at, he feels those aren't enough for the group of boys that he's with. And so he has to trump those up to seem even better than he was. And then we'll go through this last part and take questions. My natural mother had by this time fled from the center of Babylon. And here Babylon is taking the sense of, the sense that it has in Revelations, Babylon, the center of all immorality. My natural mother had fled from the center, but though she still lingered in its suburbs. She warned me to live chastely, but did not extend her care to restraining me within the bounds of conjugal love. This behavior of mine. So Monica is telling him not to do these things, but Augustine's saying the one avenue that St. Monica could have offered to him was Christian marriage, and she refuses to do that. Her reluctance to arrange a marriage for me arose from the fear that if I were encumbered with a wife, my hope could be dashed. Not hope for you in the world to come, to which she held herself, but hope of my academic success. Both my parents were very keen on my making progress in study. My father, because he thought next to nothing about you and only vain things about me. And my mother, because she regarded the customary course of studies as no hindrance and even a considerable help toward gaining you eventually. So at least do I interpret their respective attitudes, as I remember them now as best I can. So St. Monica is absolutely set on Augustine becoming fully Christian, but she's also set on him becoming successful in the secular world, him using education as a way of advancing himself. And she gives him warnings about behaviors he shouldn't be engaging in, but she doesn't arrange a marriage for him because she sees that marriage as something that would be a hindrance to his education and his development in this world. And so once again, we have this teenage boy who on the one hand is absolutely his parents' pride and joy, but they love him so much, yet won't do anything in this moment to help him with this torment that he's in. Okay, so we'll take our third little pause right there, and we'll deal with questions. Or you can also, I'm assuming everybody needs a bit of a mental break at this point in time. Grew up in a male chauvinist society. Oh yeah, it's hard to appreciate just how male chauvinistic the Greco-Roman world is. Um, and part of it is when we learn about ancient Rome, we learn about it, generally speaking, from people who love ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So they want us, and a flaw most teachers have, they want us to love something the way they love it. So rather than presenting all of it, people who talk about Rome and Greece tend not to talk about its horrible downsides, widespread infanticide. Um, in Roman society, women were the legal property of their fathers and then their husbands. In ancient Athens, women were not allowed out in public without a male escort. I mean, we can think of classical Athens as the seat of democracy and blah, blah, blah. Um, but the laws about women in Athens, the closest country to that today is Saudi Arabia. Um, Spartan women had far more rights than that. Um, so, I mean, just the incredibly, chauvinist doesn't even describe just how incredibly sexist the Greco-Roman world was. And that was something that Christianity, though Christianity wasn't able to create the perfect society, um, a level of sexual equality becomes part of the Western tradition that never, ever would have happened without it. Oh, so St. Monica crying for his conversion. And so I want to be certain I'm expressing what Augustine's criticisms of St. Monica are. He's never accusing her of being cynical or not having his best interests at heart. She does cry 20 years for his conversion. She wants him to be a Christian. She wants him to fully accept God. She wants him to accept God's love above all. But that doesn't mean that she's perfect in her actions. And Augustine, and maybe her course of action was the right one. We have Augustine's record of this, not hers. But Augustine does have these questions that are just never left settled, that it seems to him that she's placing his worldly success ahead of both his physical and emotional and spiritual health at this point in time, and he doesn't understand that. Oh, okay, so the question of Augustine and interiority. So answering this the best I can without nerding out and becoming one of those masters that Augustine talks about, picking pedantic fights with their fellows. That Augustine invented interiority is true and false. With Augustine, the sense of the inner life, the idea of there being a radical distinction between the things we believe, what we want to do, and the way that we present ourselves in the world. With Augustine, that comes out with a clarity that it simply doesn't in any other author for quite some time. In the sense of interiority, as we would understand it today, Western culture today is so soaked in hyper individualism that when we talk about interiority, we're talking about this utter uniqueness of every individual, and the real you is what you think and not what you do. And it very quickly devolves into psychobabble. So as Augustine is recognizing and talking about what we'll call the fragment itself, and it's probably the best term for describing Augustine, what we have in Confessions, the fragment itself, because that's what Augustine presents himself as, at fragmented. There's part of him that's being pulled towards Christianity. There's part of him that's being pushed in this worldly direction. There's the desires that he has himself that he can't even fulfill. That part of him is chasing all of these lustful adventures to deal with these passions that he can't control, but he knows that it's wrong at the same time. And that fantastic line out of St. Paul, that I do not understand what I do, for what I would do, I do not do, and that which I would not do is what I do. Augustine understands that perfectly. So the interior life, in the sense of there being a radical division between what we experience in mind that's personal to ourselves, and Augustine talks about that. that only God knows us interiorly. When Augustine was talking in that first book about the infant that's trying to make known what they want, but only God can know our inner desires, even when we don't know them perfectly well. So the interiority that Augustine has is an interiority that is ultimately dependent on God. Augustinian interiority is when the fragments of ourself coming together and returning towards God. The way that the modern world would try to describe interiority as a psychic phenomenon is something that would make zero sense to Augustine at all. So Augustine and interiority, it is something that is unique to Augustine, at least to the level that he discusses it. I mean, throughout the Middle Ages, you'll have debates that pop up first, I believe, with Peter Abelard in the late 11th century, talking about the interior forum of the conscience, and making a distinction between what we actually do in the world and what we wished that we would do in the world. But interiority, in a modern sense of just us recognizing everything around us, that's not really what Augustine is interested in. So I mean, and Augustine, he's the ancient philosophers that talk about interiority, generally, not nearly to the extent that Augustine does, but even they aren't talking about it the way that is brought about in certain academic circles, which is best left to academic circles. Okay, with that, so self-disclosure, helping us to come to a better understanding of our own motives. That is what all of Confessions is about. But what we have to keep in mind here is that Augustine is not primarily writing self-help literature. That's a secondary role that it has, of course. And he wants to write something that is useful in the hands of other Christians struggling the way that he does, because they're human. But that self-disclosure ultimately is, and I said this before, and we'll see how this works, everything comes back to the relation with God. And, I mean, as he's talking here about their attitudes, it comes back to the relation with God that he isn't building at the time, that he's trying to turn his back on, and that God allows him to turn his back on. And so now we're going to come into the episode of the pear tree, which it's one of the more famous episodes of Confessions. And it's one of those things that in modern, whatever sense of modern morality there is, it seems like Augustine is spending a lot of time worrying about something that's not a big deal. But what Augustine's discussing here is a huge deal. Self-disclosure, our own motives. Beyond question, theft is punished by your law, O Lord, and by the law written in human hearts, which not even sin itself can erase. For does any thief tolerate being robbed by another thief, even if he is rich and the other is driven by want? I was under no compulsion of need, unless a lack of moral sense can count as need, and a loathing for justice, and a greedy, full-fed love of sin. Yet I wanted to steal, and steal I did. I already had plenty of what I stole, and of much better quality too. And I had no desire to enjoy it when I resolved to steal it. I simply wanted to enjoy the theft for its own sake and the sin. So before Augustine even tells us what he does, he's getting into all of that sense of the motivation. Why did we do what we did? So self-disclosure, this is all that this is about. Close to our vineyard, there was a pear tree laden with fruit. This fruit was not enticing, either in appearance or in flavor. We nasty lads went there to shake down the fruit and carry it off at dead of night, after prolonging our game out of doors until that late hour, according to our abominable custom. We took enormous quantities, not to feast on ourselves, but perhaps to throw to pigs. We did eat a few, but that was not our motive. We derived pleasure from the deed simply because it was forbidden. So they rob a pear tree. And the modern response would be he's talking about all of these sexual sins, and now he's going to stop to worry about a couple of stolen pears. But the motivation is everything. They didn't go to take these pears because they wanted to eat the pears. And he says clearly, I mean, we had better pears at home. These weren't pears, they were unripe pears. Maybe we'll even throw them to pigs. It's just the joy of sin. It's just the joy of that which is forbidden. Look upon my heart, O God. Look upon this heart of mine, on which you took pity in its abysmal depths. Enable my heart to tell you now what it was seeking in this action, which made me bad for no reason, in which there was no motive for my malice except malice. The malice was loathsome, and I loved it. I was in love with my own ruin, in love with decay. Not with the thing for which I was falling into decay, but with decay itself. For I was depraved in soul, and I leapt down from your strong support into destruction, hungering not for some advantage to be gained by the foul deed, but for the foulness of it. So what Augustine's talking about here, and what he's going to talk about for the rest of book 2, is this. For all of the reasons that we might have for committing bad deeds, there, as he talks in question of motives, there might be something beautiful that we wanted, so we take it for ourselves. There might be honors or worldly rank, the same honors he was talking about previously. The possibility of gaining power through this, to settle old scores. All of these things, they're terrible things, but at least in all of them, the person who's committing that sin gains something from it. Avarice, you have the reward of material goods. Power, to dominate other people. You have, even though it's a twisted end, you get to enjoy watching others suffer that you want to make suffer. But Augustine's getting nothing out of this here. I was in love with my own ruin, in love with decay. What he's talking about here is the state of soul that's in vice, but the state of the soul that has given itself over to autonomy. And what I mean by that is Augustine knows, and we'll first of all notice that this pear tree, he didn't make up this episode. The way that he's describing this definitely happened. If he was making it up, it would have had other marks to it. But as we were talking about how Augustine is his parents' pride and joy, you have a pear tree here, and it's a pear tree that's going to bear great fruit someday. Eventually, those pears are going to be wonderful, and they're going to be pleasing to others. And Augustine destroys it just to destroy something. The pear tree on the one level is himself. He's not inventing the story as a metaphor, but he's recognizing the metaphor in his own actions. He's in love with his own ruin. And it's the soul caught in addiction is a word with a very specific meaning, but if we apply that to any vice, it works. And we all have those vices where beyond just doing something out of habit because it's going to temporarily make us happy, that's what we were talking about before. Now we've gotten to the point where you're engaging in something because you no longer feel yourself worthy, that you no longer feel yourself worthy of love. The person who feels that they're beyond hope, that they're beyond redemption. And they respond to the world with that feeling. It's if I'm going to be hated by the world, I'm going to earn that hate. And I'm going to love destroying myself. And that's what Augustine has. I mean, he literally says that I was in love with my own. The malice was loathsome and I loved it. That he's in love with nothing at all. Not for some advantage to be gained, but just the foulness of it. And it's anybody who's had the experience of being so lost, and lost here is not metaphorical for Augustine. Love and the relation with God is everything. Sin for Augustine is a turning away from God. It's a turning away from God, and it's the sin of Lucifer. It's the sin of Adam and Eve, is what we would call self-deification. The idea that rather than as a creature who's dependent upon the Creator, you can only find true fulfillment in loving the Creator. The idea that that is no longer part of your life, that you can't accomplish that. And so you make something else your own God. And that's, I mean, Lucifer's rebellion is the attempt to be completely independent from the Creator rather than a creature. Adam and Eve, when Satan tempts Eve, he tempts her with the one thing that she does not have. And she does not have, he offers her to be like God. And so for Augustine, the love of God ultimately is to draw us back to God, who is our Creator and our source. And so we yearn to return to that source. And that is pure love. Sin is what Eve is doing, to try to be like God through our own efforts. And when that fails, when you have that experience of trying to find satisfaction, the idea of, we know that true joy is only within the Lord, but we're going to find all of these petty joys here and there, and we're going to try to make them work. And when they don't work, rather than returning to God, we give ourselves completely over to our own ruin, and we fall in love with that ruin. The soul that is in despair and becomes enamored with their own destruction. If we haven't personally experienced it, we've had that friend that we watched that self-sabotages. And logically, you look at this and you know that they have to know what they're doing to themselves, and you wonder, why are they self-sabotaging? And they're self-sabotaging because, like Augustine here, he's on the one hand the pride and joy of his parents, but on the other hand, they're doing nothing to help him as he's burning in his lust. All they can imagine is this great thing in the future. And so he completely embraces what he's fallen into, and he loves his own ruin. He loves the act of self-destruction here. And the act of self-destruction, the love of self-destruction, is, at least it's mine. You cannot control God. That's the nature of the relationship between creature, and Creator. But the soul that is in love with their own destruction, it's theirs. They have it completely. And so what Augustine wants to know is, what is this actually that it is to be in love with his own ruin? And it ends up being his look at what is evil. What is the kind of sin that he's getting into here? Moving on to 11. So then, when people look for the reason why some criminal act has been committed, their account is usually reckoned credible only when it is evident that there may have been greed on the malefactor's part to gain possession of goods belonging to someone else, those goods we have lowest, or fear of losing his own. And so that the motivation that we were talking about earlier, that just does not apply here. For these good things, excuse me. Truly are beautiful and lovely in their own way, even though base and mean in comparison with higher goods that bring true happiness. Suppose someone has committed homicide. Why did he do it? Perhaps he was in love with the victim's wife, or coveted his estate, or wanted to steal from him in order to support himself, or feared to be robbed of the like himself by the other man, or had been injured and burned for revenge. Is it likely that he would kill another person without any motive, simply because he enjoyed killing? Who could believe that? Admittedly, it is reported of a certain frenzied and outrageously cruel man that he preferred being evil and cruel with no provocation. But a motive for his crimes was nonetheless declared. He wished to ensure, the historian tells us, neither hand nor mind should atrophy from inaction. We might ask further, and what else did he intend? He meant to use his crime for the training of his young conspirators. And here, Augustine is talking about the conspiracy of Catiline, Catiline who wanted to overthrow the Roman Senate in the first century BC. But even here, Catiline did not love his criminal acts for their own sake, but only the advantage he had in view when committing them. So Catiline didn't murder for love of murder. He used it because that was a way to power. How does this apply to me, poor wretch? What did I love in you, O my theft? What did I love in you, the nocturnal crime of my 16th year? There was nothing beautiful about you, for you were nothing but a theft. Are you really anything at all for me to be speaking to you like this? What does it mean to be in love with a theft, but not talk about it in terms of what was stolen? O good God, creator of all things, and more beautiful than all of them, those pears we stole did have a certain beauty because they were your creation. Yours, O God, who are the highest good and the true good for me. Those pears were beautiful, but they were not what my miserable soul loved. I had plenty of better ones, and I plucked them only for the sake of stealing. For once I picked, I threw them away. And we remember that he says that he might have thrown them to the pigs. And he's that line in there that we might have thrown them to the pigs, he adds in, and that's clearly recalling, don't throw what is holy before swine. Even if some morsel of the pears did enter my mouth, it was only the criminal act that lent it savor. So now, Lord my God, when I ask what it was that gave me pleasure in that theft, I find nothing of fair, seductive form at all. I do not mean simply that it lacked the beauty to be found in justice and prudence, or the beauty of human mind and intelligence, or that of our senses and bodily life, or the beauty inherent in the stars, so lovely in their appointed places, or in the earth and the sea, full of young life, born there to replace the things that die. What he's doing there is going through the list of beauty, the philosophical beauty of an ideal like justice or prudence, the intellectual beauty, then the lowest form, which is still beauty, sensual beauty of bodily life. And he goes through things that are beautiful. No, I mean more. My theft lacked even the sham, shadowy beauty, which even vice allures us. For in vice there lurks a counterfeit beauty. Pride, for instance, even pride apes sublimity, whereas you are the only God, most high above all things. As for ambition, what does it crave but honors and glory, while you are worthy of honor beyond all others and eternally glorious? The ferocity of powerful men aim to inspire fear, but who is to be feared except the one God? Can anything be snatched from his power or withdrawn from it? When or where or whither or by whom? Flirtatiousness aims to arouse love by its charming wiles, but nothing can hold more charm than your charity, nor could anything be loved to greater profit than your truth, which outshines all else in luminous beauty. Curiosity poses as pursuit of knowledge, whereas you know everything in supreme degree. Even ignorance or stupidity masquerades as simplicity and innocence, but nothing that exists is simpler than yourself. And what could be more innocent than you, who leave the wicked hounded by their own sins? And so he goes through all of these things, all of them, which don't match up to what it is. And here we have, and this is where we'll start wrapping today, 14. A soul that turns away from you, therefore lapses into fornication when it seeks apart from you what it can never find in pure and limpid form, except by returning to you. All of those great things that make sense to go after here, that Augustine lists. All of these things that make sense. There is some beauty in these things, provided that we don't pursue them as though they're better than God. And what happens is when we pursue those things apart from God, when we make those things our God, we turn away from God in order to do this, and we worship something that is far inferior. All those who wander far away and set themselves up against you are imitating you, but in a perverse way. Yet by this very mimicry, they proclaim that you are the creator of the whole of nature, and that in consequence, there is no place whatever where they can hide from your presence. With regard to my theft, then, what did I love in it, and in what sense did I imitate my Lord, even if only with vicious perversity? Did the pleasure I sought lie in breaking the law, at least in that sneaky way? since I was unable to do so with any show of strength? Was I in truth a prisoner, trying to simulate a sort of crippled freedom, attempting a shady parody of omnipotence by getting away with something forbidden? How like that servant of yours who fled from the Lord and hid in the shadows. What rottenness, what a misshapen life, rather a hideous pit of death. To what was wrong simply because it was wrong. To do what was wrong simply because it was wrong. Could I have found pleasure in that? And as we come back to all of this, and he goes on and on and on, and I'm hoping that after this you can go back and reread this, understanding sort of what the larger picture is. The pleasure did not lie in the pairs. It must have been the crime is committed in the company of others who shared in that sin. And that's something else that we get to, is that Augustine is not, he has the self-destructiveness here, but it's also the fact that he would not have stolen these sins if it wasn't, these pairs, if it wasn't for those around him. The same way that he had to brag to them about sexual deeds he did not even commit. There's a love of nothingness that he has here, and it's a love of nothingness that comes out of the perversity of the so-called friendship he has with those around him. On my own, I would not have perpetrated that theft in which I felt no desire for what I stole. What an exceedingly unfriendly form of friendship that was. And so right there, this love of nothing that he's become. I'm sorry, the love of nothingness itself, because that's what evil is for Augustine. Is it's not an independent being, it's a privation. That there is, God is the creator, God is the source of everything. To turn away from God is to turn away from the source of creation. To try to love something, not even as Augustine was talking about here, setting up something that would be a mimicry of God, but to love something in a way that focuses the self on nothingness. That's what evil is ultimately a privation completely of the good. And that's what he's falling into here with this group of friends that he has. The thrill of doing wrong, which ultimately is absolutely hollow. So with there, we'll finish up with any other questions that we might have. Okay, and if there aren't any questions, as I said, if anything occurs to you during the week, feel free to send me an email. As we go ahead next week, this notion of evil that Augustine's brought up here, of sin, where it's being lost. And there's, I guess the last thought that we'll leave here. 3 ways of looking at evil: sin, guilt, and ritual uncleanliness. Ritual uncleanliness is usually put in the metaphor of you have a stain that you need to wash off. Sin is put in the sense of an interior burden that you bring. I'm sorry, guilt is a burden that you bring with you. Sin here is a wandering. It's being cut off from your destination. And if we bring that back to everything is the relationship with God, sin then is destroying that relationship between oneself and God, but also between oneself and the world, because we're using it for different purposes than God created it. It's a skewed relationship that one has, not just with God, but with everything else that's been created. All right, thank you very much. I will go ahead, get this, the lecture uploaded. I'll send an email with that. Thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next week.